Guten Abend miteinander, good evening. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Elie Holzer tonight. Dr. Elie Holzer was born in Antwerp, Belgium, and studied and taught at Yeshivat Sehen in Montreux, as well as in Yeshivat Hester Michal in Jerusalem, and in a variety of institutions in Israel and in the United States. He received rabbinical ordination and earned a PhD in Jewish philosophy from Hebrew University, and he also holds a bachelor degree in psychology and a BEd in Jewish education from Herzog College, and is a certified philosophical counselor from the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, and a graduate from the Mandel Jerusalem Fellows program for senior educators, and from the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Very impressive. Nowadays, Dr. Elie Holzer is a practice-oriented philosopher of Jewish education. His research integrates text-based Jewish studies, philosophical hermeneutics, pedagogy, and ethical spiritual traditions. He serves as assistant professor at the School of Education of Bar-Ilan University, where he also holds the Dr. Ox Chair for Teaching Jewish Religious Studies, and is the director of the Stern Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Education. He's also a publisher of books, an author of books. For example, I'm not going to list all of the books: A Philosophy of Chavruta, Understanding and Teaching the Art of Text Study in Peers, or Edged Sword, Military Activism in the Thought of Religious Science, for example. Yes. Elie Holzer has served as, that's where I know you from, you have served as the co-founder of the Shira Hadasha community in Jerusalem, and he has been labeled as an academic spiritual activist and as a Davenologist, which I don't know what it is. I know, but Davenologist, okay. Referring to his ongoing efforts to create learning opportunities for individuals' religious growth in and through prayer, song, and Hasidic text study. He's married to Susie, father of 3 daughters, and lives in Jerusalem.
Thank you.
May I ask you?
Good evening, everyone. Almost Erev Shabbat Shalom. Let's say Erev Shabbat Shalom. It's a real delight to be here. As someone who was raised in French and spent most of his life teaching in other foreign languages, Hebrew, English, I appreciate your efforts to come and learn and study together in English, and I urge you to make little signs if I'm talking too fast, or if I'm using vocabulary that you may not be really acquainted with. Just feel free just to wave your hands, and I will obviously be happy to reconsider what I just said and say it a different way. It is a special delight to be here from what I know about Bereschit, and this will probably help me a little bit to begin to frame what I invite you to do tonight. I understand that I guess there are many, but one of the reasons and the purposes of Bereschit was to allow scholars and rabbis and leaders of the Jewish world, but particularly from Israel, to come here and share with you teachings, thoughts, ideas that they're working on, sharing and teaching in other places. And in a way, although I understand it's not only Israel, but still it's a way to bring a little bit of Israel here, which I find really very, very special, especially those days in Europe, where I think there are very few communities where you could find such a kind of bridge, a cultural and spiritual bridge that is constructed. So I feel like privileged to be here, and particularly because what I'm going to share with you tonight and invite you to think about are things that I am currently working on. This is not something that I've written already. I'm working on this project. And in many ways, I think, I hope also that it reflects some very good and productive and, I would say, optimistic things that are happening in this Israeli society. We are used to talk a lot about all the challenges and the problems in Israeli societies, and I'm not saying they're not. And yet, there is something in the new generation, I think, and I can see even this in the younger generation, where there is some kind of new search for Jewish voices grounded in our tradition, which have something to say to the life of people today, and I would say not only to Jews, even to non-Jews. In other words, for me as a Zionist, as someone who left Yerushalayim Shel Ma'arav, which is usually called Antwerp, and I have no problem doing it. For me, Zionism is first and foremost to be able to have Jews defending Jews wherever and whenever they are attacked. But for me, Zionism is also a lot what I've learned from Echad Ha'am, from Rav Kook, and from others, which is really the ability and the freedom, the freedom to be engaged with our tradition, with our religious tradition, and to seek in it old/new voices for our lives today and for the next generation. And all of my work in Jewish education, both as a researcher, but all the titles that you heard, this is just to get a job at university. But I'm not more than a melamed. I'm really a melamed, and that's really what I care about. All the rest is just instrumental. And I own this seeking and this search to my own Rebbe, Mori Rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Bochko Zichrono Livracha, who used to be Rosh Yeshiva in Montreux, in Switzerland. And in a way, that regard for me to come back to Switzerland is a little bit like coming back home. I've spent many years in Montreux, and many more years and vacations with Bnei Akiva and with my parents in Switzerland. So to make all those connections alive is really, really an honor for me. And I hope that I will bring you a little bit of these new voices and these new thoughts that people are working on in a free space in the state of Israel today. I cannot say, or let's put it this way, when Yaakov was kind enough to contact me and he asked me to come, so I had some ideas of what I might share with you. I, of course, could not know the terrible week in which we all are thrown in, but I was already aware of, obviously, Israel, as you know, it's a different story, but it's taking place there. Not much more often in different ways, but the recent very difficult period of time, I don't have to be more specific about what we are going through in the streets, and as of today, I understand today, 5 people have been killed, 2 of them as they were praying. And in many ways, I would like to say that the very few things I will share with you today are deeply connected to that. I'm not a soldier anymore. I'm too old for that. And military defense has to do what it has to do. But education is the only gateway and venue to try to educate human beings to a better world. There's nothing that can replace it. And I'd like to begin this learning by quoting someone who today has written an article in Le Figaro, that from what I could read in Le Figaro, it has been published in major newspapers in Europe, probably in Switzerland also, I don't know which newspaper. You look it up on Google when you go home. Abdenour Bidar, B-A-D-A-R, who is a Muslim intellectual, spiritually engaged in Islam and wrote a very important letter or article calling to Muslim people and educators and leaders to do what we would call a kind of cheshbon nefesh, self-searching, self-critique. However, he says, and I must say I really identify with what he says here. He said, it's not enough to say that this kind of Islam, which kills people in the name of God, is not the true Islam that we used to know once in the past. You can't build a romantic past only as opposed to the present. Because he says the clash with ISIS, with Daesh, is on who is the authentic past. You need to re-engage with your tradition with fresh eyes, but with a commitment and a love of your tradition. And be able, this is already my language, to see if you can hear new voices which you may not have been able to hear until now. And that summarizes, I think, the work I am trying to do as a researcher, but first and foremost as a melamed. If there is any hope for the world, I believe it is by rethinking what is the role and the place of spirituality in people's life today. It's a big word, I won't say that much about it today, but this is the task of this generation. I believe so for Israel, and I believe so for many other countries in Europe for sure. So what we are going to do now is a little snapshot, as they say in America. It's like a little picture of a broader topic which many sociologists, social critics, and intellectuals are writing about. I'd like to begin by looking together with you at 3 places in the Chumash. And I will begin with Bereschit. How am I doing with the English? Okay? So, the Torah in Sefer Bereschit, like the entire Torah, it simply said extraordinarily in the richness of obviously what we have there. One theme that crosses through the Torah, but especially in Sefer Bereschit, is the theme of looking, re'iyah, or they say in America, the gaze, le regard in French. How do you say it in Switzerland? Blick, right. Le regard, blick. I'll give you 3 examples. Please open Bereschit, Perek Gimel, Pasuk Vav. Bereschit, Perek Gimel, Pasuk Vav. Are you with me? We all know this. We've learned it many times. ותרא האישה כי טוב העץ למאכל וכי תאווה מול העיניים ונחמד העץ להשכיל ותיקח מפריו ותאכל וכו'. And the woman saw, she looked at the tree and it was what? טוב למאכל. It seemed to be good to be consumed, to be eaten. וכי תאווה הוא לעיניים. You can help me with the translation in German or in Swedish. מה זה תאווה לעיניים?
בגירתה.
Okay, thank you. ונחמד העץ להשכיל. להשכיל is also, להשכיל is השכלה, is to grab by understanding, by the concept. להבין, להשכיל. It is also a way to look at things, but it is an inner eye. The inner look. When you really understand an idea, you see it. You see it in your imagination. So as we know, this is the sin. But in fact, the entire question about what is it that people look at and how is what they look at and how they look at things influence the way they live. Is a theme that crosses all Bereschit. So it begins here, it actually begins even in the beginning of the beginning, which is the first thing that God creates, the first day is light. And the rabbis immediately say, yeah, but that's not the light that we use, it's light that is already immediately concealed, ganuz. It is hidden. So there is a light of something that you see that you can't see. That's in the rabbinic tradition. Let's go, for instance, to Perek Chaf, Pasuk Yud Tet. Perek Chaf, Perek Chaf Aleph. Vayera, Chaf Aleph, Pasuk Yud Tet. We are at the end of Parashat Vayera. Hagar and Ishmael were chased, exiled by Sarah basically, and then she misses waters. She can't see the young boy who is about to die, and then there is a whole thing about Vayifkach Elohim et Elea. You with me, Pasuk Yutet? God opens her eyes. Vayifkach. It's the same verb that happened in Gan Eden. Vayifkachu et Enehem, right? Vatere be'er mayim. So she saw a well of water. Vatelech vatamaleh et hachemet. She fills in the bucket. Vatash et hanar, and she gives it to drink to the Nile. Vayi Elohim et hanar, vayigdal vayeshev bamidbar, vayi rova kashet. Now, what's going to be the place, the name of this place here, where this happens? Who remembers?
Be'er Lachai Roi.
Be'er Lachai Roi. Be'er Lachai Roi. You hear? The well, or the living, that can be seen, Roi. You're going to ask me, so what's the connection between Gan Eden looking and here looking? What I'm saying, if we would have a couple of hours, we would walk through all Sefer Bereschit. You see how often there's something about opening the eyes, opening the look, opening the gaze. Another example, please go to Perek Lamed Zayin. Perek Lamed Zayin, Parashat Vayeshev, Pasuk Yudchet. Lamed Zayin Yudchet. This is a very dramatic moment. This is the moment where Joseph's brothers are about to basically kidnap him. First they want to kill him, and then they decide to put him in the pit and to sell him. Right? This is the moment of, they say in French, fratricide. That means brothers killing or hurting each other, of human fraternity. And look how the Torah says that. ויראו אותו מרחוק, ובטרם יקרב אליהם, ויתנפלו אותו לעמיתו. They saw him from afar coming, and even before he got to them, they decided to kill him. Now, they saw him from afar, meaning geographically, right? From afar. But Chachamenu read, ויראו אותו מרחוק. It is their brother, but they see him as being afar. In other words, you can be very close, but they see you as very foreign. It's all about how you look. And then obviously, you already need them to kill. So this is just to give you a little idea of what's going on. And maybe, I wouldn't call this the grande finale, but the biggest crescendo is a parasha which has the name of Vayera. Parashat Vayera is all about Re'iyah. Sdom Vayaku besanverim. What God does, He blinds them. Lot's wife, who wants to turn around to see. Avraham et Yaakov, Hashem yira'eh, Hashem yir'ah. It crosses all the parasha. It has 15 times in the parasha. It is as if the Torah, in the undercurrent of the Torah story, there's a whole attention called for the reader and the learner about looking. And obviously now going back to the beginning of the parasha, Parashat Vayera, Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Aleph. Vayera, you with me? Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Aleph. The last time you have to switch pages, I promise you. Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Aleph. Now, when we use our eyes to look at the psukim, being aware of the importance of Vayera, look what it is that you can see. Vayera elav, which is already God, showed himself, or made himself visible to him. To whom? To Avraham. This is right after the Brit Milah. Be'elonei mamre. You with me? Vayera, Perek Yudchet. It's page Kafle, okay? Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamre. והוא יושב פתח האוהל כחום היום, he said at the time. And then, you see, Vayisa enough. He has to lift his eyes as if everyone knows when you look, you lift your eyes. But the Torah emphasizes all those movements. Vayisa enough, and then what? Vayar. והנה שלושה אנשים ניצבים עליו. And again, vayar. וירץ לקראתם. You see, once you begin to look at that, it just pops up all the time. And we will go back to those psukim towards the end of our learning. Here is my second introduction. I bought a very, very, very poor copy of a very famous painting. Rembrandt's anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicolaus Stuhl, 1632. Rijksmuseum Amsterdam.
No, Margaret's house tonight. Margaret's house tonight.
I didn't check. I was sure it was Amsterdam. I should have
Saw it 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow. So what is it that you see on this picture? Rembrandt is very careful, obviously. Extraordinary painter. What is it that he tries to pay our attention to? What stands out? Many things. Among them. What do you see? Oh, you're putting out the gaze, the look of everyone. So what is it they're looking at? This guy was just hanged a couple of hours earlier because he robbed a shop or something like that. Okay, so he's dead. It's a true story. And the doctor, this is a doctor teaching anatomy to the students. Right? So, as you said, very nice, doing something about the gaze. Clearly Rembrandt is interested in this to catch our gaze, to their look. Okay? So look, for instance, he is looking at the book. See? As you said, most of them are looking at the teacher or away. What's happened to the eyes of that person? Rembrandt put some shade on it, right? As he likes to do in his paintings, right? It's to say, as if he's present and not present. Present and not present. One of the interpretations that are very traditionally given to this painting is that Rembrandt becomes aware of how the beginning of modern science, this is very early still, changes the gaze of people on the human body. The human body is something that needs to be studied, opened up, checked. it is a certain gaze that we need, and we are the beneficiary of those developments, obviously, because we understand the human body much better. We can obviously help. But it changes something about in the culture about how people look at things, especially at the body. Especially at the body. Now, since then, much time has gone through, and there is a whole literature about how, even non-consciously, people look at the body. The body is very often taught as a tool, or just a cover for something that is inside. Today the body has become, that's another kind of literature, I would say something for exposition, tattoos, right? Bodybuilding. If we go deeper, obviously, the body is perceived very often for aesthetics, or for its lust, for its attractiveness. These are all different ways to look at the body, which then develop by human beings certain ways of looking. But not only the body. Let me just throw this in on the table. Some most recent research show how, for many people, young people especially, you actually do not have, let's say, someone who will be here tonight is not really here tonight until he or she will take a picture of him or herself and right away post it on or Instagram. So there's a way to be only by to be seen. Visibility sometimes non-consciously equals existing. If you're not visible, you don't exist. I'm not saying everyone is like that, I'm saying this is a clear feature of the culture today, visibility. What wouldn't people do in order to be visible? Because if you are visible, you recognize you exist. Now, what could and should, I think, be a Jewish voice in that context today? Both to the way we look at the body, and we are referring to the terrible events that are taking place in Europe, in the world, in Israel. Especially, I must say, I'm very sensitive to this, like everyone, but especially because all those murders are done in the name of God. In the name of God. Is the alternative to that a secular understanding and critique of religion and a secular way of living? Should we get rid of God and religion in order to make place for human fraternity? I don't think so. But what is the gaze to be cultivated at the human body of the other person and of yourself? That's the question I would like to explore with you. So the way I do this, and that's the way I invite you to do this, is by reading and listening to teachings in our tradition, and you have to say in the Hasidic tradition especially. So everything you know about Hasidim and Hasidut, I don't know what you know, but just put it on the side for a moment. Okay? I'm talking about Hasidism as it was expressed by thinkers of Hasidim, masters of Hasidim. I'm not talking about the sociological expression of it, which people may have different feelings about what they feel about. But in order to be able to listen to the power of those ideas, which in Hasidism they find back in our Torah as a living Torah for our lives today, I sometimes like to invite in the same Beit Midrash and create a chavruta, people sitting together, my guests. So my guests today are, as you will see, the Sfas Emes, That's the way you say it's Sfat Emet. Sfas Emes. Second rabbi of the Gerer Hasidim. A great master of Jewish spirituality. And I don't know if he would like this or not. For sure his Hasidim would not like this, but I don't care. I invite to study next to the Sfat Emet two authors. One is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the Little Prince. And the other one is the greatest poet of the 20th century, Rainer Maria Rilke. And I do that not because I want to be apologetic, to say, oh, isn't that amazing that in our tradition we have the same ideas as in Saint-Exupéry. That's not interesting. I'm just saying, here we have allies, friends. Saint-Exupéry as a modern thinker, Rilke as a modern poet, did not want to go back to the 18th century. But they were both aware, with many other artists in very different realms, that modern life has also very challenging and negative aspects. And they tried to warn human beings about those negative aspects. So for me to be able to think about the spirituality today for the next generation requires also the ability to think and to listen to those critiques. What is it that Saint-Exupéry was afraid we are losing? What's happening to our gaze, to our look? That's 72 years ago. The Little Prince was written in 43 in New York. Now, some of you, let me just check, who read The Little Prince at least once in the last 10 years? 20 years? Who never read The Little Prince? Okay, we still have some education to make up. I'm telling you why. Because we are Jews are very proud to say that the Tanakh is the book that has been translated the most in the most languages and dialects in the world. And that's true. Which is the second book which has been the most translated in the world. The Little Prince. And you're going to say, yes, but it's a nice book for little children. I don't think it's for little children. Only. There is a whole chain of interpreters, there is a whole range of interpretation, from psychoanalysis to Marxist thinking. But there's a whole range of people who really believe that. And I must say, when I have a chavuda between the Little Prince and the Sfas Emes, it's flying. Because then we can really actually hear what the Sfas Emes is saying. And how he highlights amazing ideas and educative ideas that we have in the Torah. So that's what the time we have. We won't read everything that you have on your page. There is more than what we will read, but you are invited first to read the book, and then to read back those highlights. The theme of looking and the gaze is running through the Little Prince, from the beginning, in a very, very subtle way. So here's how it begins. The Little Prince begins by the author telling that when he was a little kid, he had read a story about a boa constrictor, which is like a kind of big snake, which just had swallowed an animal. So what he did, he designed the snake with the animal inside. You see the first drawing? That's the first drawing. So he asked, I'm going to the second paragraph. I showed my masterpiece to the grown-ups. Who are the grown-ups? We, right? And asked them whether the drawing frightened them. But they answered, frightened? Why should anyone be frightened by a hat? So the little, as he was, it was not the Little Prince, it's the author. As he was a kid, he could see the animal beyond the drawing. You see that this already begins at the edge at the frontier between the seen and the unseen. What is it that you see that prevents you to see what you could see? When you see the hat, you can't see with your imagination. What? The animal. I continue. My drawing was not a picture of a hat. It was a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant. But since the grown-ups were not able to understand it, you see, the grown-ups for Saint-Exupéry cannot understand. Why? Because they only understand what they see. I made another drawing. I drew the inside of the boa constrictor so the grown-ups could see it clearly. They always need, the adults, always need to have things explained. If not, they don't understand. So that's the second drawing. What was the response of the grown-ups? They say, paragraph number 3, the grown-ups' response this time was to advise me to lay aside my drawings of boa constrictors, whether from the inside or the outside. In Yiddish they say, hak nish in Chainik. Okay, could you please move on to serious stuff? Okay, it's time for you to grow. And devote myself instead to geography, history, arithmetic, and grammar. That is why at the age of 6, I gave up what might have been a magnificent career as a painter. But this is not, as I said, only for children. What we have here is a very thoughtful example of what the greatest, I would say, sociologist of the 20th century, Max Weber, called, this is the original German term, I wrote it down for you, Entzaubering. Entzaubering. Entzauberung? Entzauberung. Excuse me. Entzauberung. In English, disenchantment. Disenchantment of the world. What does that mean? Weber understood very well that modernity and enlightenment is doing something extraordinary, which is to get out of people's system, if you could say, all the false beliefs, including religious beliefs, which prevent them to be free, to take responsibility on their lives, not to be afraid by God will punish them or anything else. And to clean that up, the system, is really the promise of modernity and a better world. But Weber understands that when you do that, the world becomes a cold place. Is there still a place for enchantment? Not when you go to Walt Disneyland, but in life. Saint-Exupéry asks, is there still a place for friendship, for love? Because if everything is reduced to numbers, to science, as much as science is important and helpful, what's left over in life? That's Weber's question. And that's what Saint-Exupéry puts in a little story for children. But it's not for children, it's for adults. Because who is going to teach the adults in this book? The little prince. Who is coming from nowhere. I would say the Hasidic reading, this is Neshama Yetera, you know it. So let's see how this works. I'm continuing to read a little bit in a little bit. In the course of this life, are you with me? That's the next paragraph. In the course of this life, I have, that's line number 24. In the course of this life, I have had a great many encounters with a great many people who have been concerned with matters of consequence. I have lived a great deal among grown-ups. I have seen them intimately, close at hand. It hasn't much improved my opinion of them. He says, I've seen grown-ups, I'm not really impressed with what I see in this world by grown-ups. Whenever I encountered a grown-up who seemed to me to me at all enlightened, this is from the German Aufklärung, right? Aufklärung. It's clear in my mind. Okay, so you see, soft, oh, this is a aufgeklärt. Yeah, but how do you say about a person who is aufgeklärt? Oh, this is an aufgeklärte Orthodox Jew. That's interesting. Okay, so soft, you see an enlightened person. I would experiment on him with my drawing number 1, which I have always kept. So he shows it what seems like a head, but is not a head. I wanted to see if he really understood anything, but he would always answer, that's a head. Then I wouldn't talk about boa constrictors or jungles of stars. I would put myself on his level and talk about bridge, golf, politics, and neckties. And then my grown-up was glad to know that I am such a reasonable person. You see, the reasonable person. Again, Saint-Exupéry, I'm going to say this the last time because I don't want to apologize every 5 minutes, right? But Saint-Exupéry is not against reason or the scientism. He's only against a world that is only driven by reason, Aufklärung, and science. When it's becoming an ideology. Saint-Exupéry did not see enough what we can see, which is a world that is driven by consumerism, where human beings are not more than a product to sell to. That's even worse, I think.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Because I don't know the piece very well. He wrote it during the Second World War.
Yes.
How could he have argued that the world is full of reason?
It's not. It's not.
How do you...
It's not full of reason. This is like ironic. This is ironic. But your question is important, I think, because it puts it in the context of the war is important. He dedicates this book to a Jew, who's a friend of him, who is in France in the Resistance. I think that the ideas that he had were already there before World War II, and it's a critique of a certain aspect of modern life. And the whole book, I will see a few more examples about the ability to friendship and to love. This is gone. This is almost gone. He had other big insights, like people have no time, people don't know what's a ritual. That's 70 years ago. It's very powerful to read that. So, just to give you a little hint, and I'm going to run this a little faster now. Chapter number 2, when the author is the pilot who's stranded in the desert with his plane. And he fell asleep, and he woke up in the morning, and there is this guy who's a little prince, doesn't know where he's coming from. And the little prince begins to tell his story. He left, he was living on a star, and he was looking for friends. And he left, there was a rose there on the star, which, you know, was like a problematic relationship. She loved him, he liked her, so he left. And he encountered all types of human beings on his way, 6 human beings, and each of these human beings, you could say, is a certain type that we find in society, or maybe it's a part in us. Also. And suddenly, you know, he meets this pilot, and he asks, the little prince asked the pilot, which is the author, to draw a sheep. A sheep. So he draws the sheep, he doesn't like the drawing twice, and the third time, what the author does is, he draws a box. And he says, this is only his box. The sheep you ask for is inside. And then the little prince is very happy. So it's all about the seen, not be seen. Just think about that on a theological level. We read the pasuk Vayira elav Hashem v'lo mamreh, and God showed Himself to Abraham. The same Torah which says in Sefer Shmot, V'lo yirani ha'adam v'chai, and no human being could see me and be alive. Seen, not seen. The rabbis, Chachamenu, Vayhi or, immediately ganuz, concealed, hidden. Seen, no seen. There's the whole thing there, which is a very different opera than only what you see is what there is. How does this go to the way people think about each other? Notice, for instance, chapter number 4. He says there was an astronomer who discovers one of the stars. He does not give to the star a name, but only a number. He might call it, for example, asteroid 325. I'm going to the next page. this asteroid has only once been seen through the telescope. That is 70 years ago. This is before internet and going to the moon. But Exupéry understand very well, like Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher, right? That the biggest invention of modernity was the telescope. Because it helps you, it enables you to see outside the world as if it is very close. It's close, but it is not close. It's a way to see without having to touch, without having to engage. Excuse me the jump, but it's not just my imagination. What effect does it do on our moral sensitivity when we see 3 minutes on the screen of 100 people shot and dead, and 2 minutes later on the same screen we're looking at the soccer game and the Weather Channel? What does it do to our sensitivity? Because we see that it's far away, it doesn't touch us. It touches, but it doesn't touch us. We move into the next thing. That's where the gaze, the look, has an impact on what we can or cannot see or feel anymore. So, the guy who saw that new star through the telescope, he said, was a Turkish astronomer in 1909. On making his discovery, the astronomer had presented it to the International Astronomical Congress in a great demonstration. But he was in Turkish costume. And so nobody would believe what he said. And the little prince says, grown-ups are like that. You know, it can be true, because he's like, you see the clothes? The clothing is what we're looking at, instead of looking at what the person has said. That's the famous phrase of the Rambam. Da et ha'emet mimi she'amara. You should know the truth. Da et ha'emet. You should know it.
קבל את האמת, לא?
הוא לא אומר כאן, הוא נרדה שם. טוב, נבדוק.
שמונה פרקים.
יש 8 פרקים, yeah. So we'll find out. Okay, maybe, I think it's that. Anyway, but accept or know the truth from whoever says it. Don't ask, well, who is this guy? You know, was she really study? I mean, you have to think. You have to engage with what he said. Don't look at the clothes. So he says, fortunately, however, for the reputation of asteroid B61-2, the Turkish dictator made a law that his subjects, under pain of death, should change to European costume. So in 1920, the astronomer gave his demonstration all over again, dressed with impressive style and elegance. And then guess what? Of course, everyone accepted his report. Okay? So he says, in line number 10, this is the grown-ups. When you tell them that you have made a new friend, they never ask you any questions about essential matters. They never say to you, what does his voice sound like? What games does he love best? Does he collect butterflies? Instead they demand, how old is he? Look at the numbers here. The ideology of the numbers. How old is he? How many brothers has he? How much does he weigh? How much money does his father make? That's we like in the Jewish community to know that. Only from these figures they think they have learned anything about him. That's why he says, line 19, I skip a little bit. The grown-ups are like that. One must not hold it against them. It's okay. Rachmunis with the old people. Old is not old, I mean grown-ups, adults. Children should always show great forbearance, that's with patience, toward grown-up people. But certainly, for us, who understand the secret of life, figures are a matter of indifference. There is a secret of life, which is more than what you see in numbers and figures and clothing. And Saint-Exupéry's fear is that something in our culture is destroying this ability to engage with the secret of life in yourself and with another person. And from that perspective, you could say he's scared to death. But that's a world where it will be, as he says, no friendship, no love. This is a very cold world in which to live. And that's why chapter 21, which I think is like the Kodesh HaKodashim of the book, which is like the heart of the heart, when the little prince is about to take leave from the fox, which is a very positive figure in this character in this book, here is a secret, says the fox, and which is the secret of the book, the secret of Saint-Exupéry. Goodbye, said the fox, and now here is my secret. A very simple secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. You see the paradox? You can see, but you have to see with your heart. It's a different kind of gaze. Because what is essential is invisible. Saint-Exupéry did not study Gomorrah. I'm sure of that. I checked his biography. He did not know that he was almost quoting Baba Metzia. El habracha shora ela badavar hasamui min ha'ayin. Blessing dwells only in those things that are hidden from or that are invisible. But that requires that we are capable of developing a way to see and to look at what is beyond the visible. And I'm not going now with theology. Should it be God? I'm not saying this. I don't think that Saint-Exupéry is a religious person in the way we are. But he understands the challenge. Now another chavruta here, and we're going to do this short, although I had the special pleasure to study the German version, which is the original version, in your honor. Rainer Maria Rilke, in one of his very famous elegian, Kapitel 8. So I think I'm afraid he's going to turn in his grave if I'm going to read this in my turn.
I believe so.
Would you please read?
I'm not a recitator.
Would you, someone would please read slowly the first lines?
Erlauben Sie
Ja,
das?
bevölker.
No.
Mit allen Augen sieht die Kreatur das Offene. Nur unsere Augen sind wie umgekehrt und ganz um sie gestellt, als Fallen rings um ihren freien Ausgang. Was draußen ist, wir wissen es aus des Tieres Antlitz allein. Denn schon das frühe Kind wenden wir um und zwingen es, das rückwärts Gestaltung sehe. Nicht das Offene, das im Tiergesicht so tief ist.
Dankeschön. Okay, so, like good poetry, that's the kind of thing we have to read a couple of times. I will just point to 2 or 3 ideas here. Mit allen Augen sieht die Kreatur das Offene. Das Offene. Die Open. Die Open. But from all the creators, Kreaturen, only one does not see this often anymore. Who's that? Human beings. So we have a the opposite of das Offene is what you find in line 36, the Gestaltung. Gestaltung. In Hebrew, Hame'utzav. Human beings, you see, he has this beautiful image where our eyes for Rilke are the eyes of the modern person. We are so used to only see the Me'utzav, the Gestaltung, what is already done. We look at the face, we only see the face. We can't see anymore the neshama, the soul that is in the face. He says, because we modern people, what happened to our eyes? It has what? Nur unsere Augen sind wie umgekehrt. It is upside down. It's a beautiful image. It is as if we are looking just the other way around. So that we only are seeing as fallen traps. But that's a very powerful image because that means that we are looking in order to trap need to grasp. I would say some people are looking at other people only in order to trap them, to put a label. They can't see beyond the clothing or anything else. That's real because fear of what is going on. So I won't read more. I'm just saying it is a profound discussion, obviously, with Saint-Exupéry, who writes later than me. But now we can listen even. Please go to page number 3. Now we can listen more thoughtfully to the Zohar and on Parashat Shmot, Parashat Vayera. When God says to Moshe, Shmot Vav Gimel, source number 3 here, Va'era el Avraham el Yitzhak ve'el Yaakov be'er Shaddai, u'shmi Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, lo nodati lehem. So I reveal myself to Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, but my name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, I made me not known to them. As you know, Yud Kei Vav Kei is Haya, Ove, Yeh. It's past, present, future. There is movement. It's not a fixed thing. This they haven't seen from me. The Zohar says as follows. This is I didn't make that up, but it is like you just read Rilke about the eye. Here's the Zohar saying. And this is the secret. Again, we're the secret. Seal your eyes means close your eyes and turn your eyeball around. Like Rilke says, our eyes are already turned, and the Zohar says, in order to see, turn them. But that's playing on the same image, obviously. Now, so you have to change something in how you look at things, and then you will see 3 colors, etc., etc. I'm not going into the Zohar now, but there's the idea of the Zohar that in order to see something else, you need to train your eye to see differently. And the fear of, as I said, many modern artists, authors, philosophers, sociologists, etc., that something is happening to our gaze, to our look today. As I said, this was all just a way to give some echo, just some echo to how now the Sfat Emet, Sfas Emes, is going to read, Vayera elav Hashem benunei ma'av. And God appeared to him in a Yes, please.
I still don't exactly understand what Saint-Exupéry meant, because these questions have been asked for centuries, for millennia. Plato writes a lot about this. Kant has written whole books about the thing which we don't see and we try to see it.
Right.
Das Ding an sich. We don't know how to look at it. So what is the chidush of something?
I think that Saint-Exupéry's chidush is that in the 20th century, his senses, maybe not for, he's not talking about specific intellectual, he said that the culture is becoming a culture in his time of scientism as an ideology. That means only the hard facts, only what you can put in a book, and also only what you can see really matters and really exists, and people don't care about anything else anymore. They lost the interplay between the visible and the invisible, which he believes is a really 20th century phenomenon. I think that's even before the era of the screens. And you shouldn't hear, I'm not saying let's just get rid of the screens. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there is a consciousness, I think, that is required, and these people very early on began to feel. And the screen and the scientism as an ideology has an implication of how people look at each other. Because if the only thing that matters are all numbers and or instrumental approach, how can I use that? What is left over for human relationships? How do we then look at our own body? Which is not a small thing in our culture. So I am not here to provide full answers. I don't think there are. I think these are very serious matters that, first of all, educators should be busy with, especially religious education. I think that's a huge question about. the gaze, what we look at, how we look at, and how we look at the body. These are like the things I put on the table today. And what I'd like to read with you, the way that Satimet reads that, is one example only of how a religious voice thinks about that. Now, Satimet didn't know all these issues that we know. But that doesn't matter. That's what I was saying in the beginning. I'm trying to reread our tradition, to listen to voices that are there, which we may have not been able to hear until now. But we can perhaps hear them when we have our eyes open in our culture, and we may have something to contribute and to say. I think that's really what I'm trying to do here. And that's why I'm taking the time sometimes to read other authors, it's not in Jewish tradition, because in their own way they can voice, they were able to voice some of the challenges. Now, I'm with you that I think the challenges that we face today are slightly different than something superior. But he gives us like a basis. And that's I didn't want to do more than that. This could be a semester course, right? You could read much more sociology and then you begin to see how visibility plays itself out in people's psyche today. Okay.
No one raises the issue before because positivism in France was already at the end of the 19th century.
I think many. I'm not saying Saint-Exupéry is the first one, and I'm not saying the only one. It's a very accessible one because it's written like in a nice little story, and that's it. And people who read the book more than once begin to feel how he's trying to leave something of the mystery of life in the middle of the book. That's really small. Of course, people did.
I think he just had a very original way of doing it, which is, I think, what appealed to a lot of people.
Of course, yes.
The medium of the story.
You didn't have to be versed in any positivism or anything else to be able to really...
Especially the idea of seeing it through the eyes of a child.
Yes.
And going through that angle, that was the original view that he had. I mean, so he didn't do it like a philosopher, he did it in his own world.
Right. But it's a shul, so I'm hesitating, but okay, I'll do it anyway. I always have a hard time to say his name, but I can't ignore that he is one of the great philosophers, Martin Heidegger. From all books, said that The Little Prince is, in his view, probably the most important literary book that was written in the 20th century. And Martin Heidegger, with all the problems of his biography, really has been one of the greatest thinkers of modernity and its challenges. So yes, I think what you're saying is precisely that. It's a very original way to say very deep things in a very simple way. And that's why the Prince could be read, and that's why I have all my students who are in education, they can't even pass the first semester in my course if they haven't read it 5 times at least. 5 times at least. Then begin to feel what's going on. Okay. So thank you for sharing that. So for the time that we still have, I'm going back to Vayera, which I said is only one example, but a very important example in the entire book of Bereschit. It's all They have one parasha which is like, it's really in your face. If you don't see Vayera being about Riyah, then you really are totally blind. It's like, it's every story, it's about Riyah. It's like, and when you listen to the way the Torah is using all those words of Riyah, it's beautiful, it's really amazing. My sense is, I haven't done all the work, but my sense is that in each of the stories, at least in Parashat Vayera, you have a different modality of Riyah that the Torah is like making us aware of. So I'm not going to do this right now, but yes, please.
Is not also a very important example when Hagar was weeping, and then we read it before, and then there is water.
Yes.
But there is also an explanation, she didn't see the water. It was not a miracle that the water was there, but she didn't see it.
Yes.
In her grief, she couldn't see it.
Correct. We're going to read about this now.
Okay.
Thank you. You're just leading us into it. So the way I do, I'm not going like a full study with Sfatamet with you now because this will require much more time. But let me just introduce you to 2-3 sources that the Sfat is working with so that you can listen what he does. Excuse me the comparison. I hope I won't hurt anyone's aesthetical feelings here, but for me the Sfat is like the Mozart of Midrash. He hears voices that only he can hear, and then he just shows it. It's like Mozart could hear voices that no normal human being could hear, and he just was able to write them down. It's amazing. And so that's why we want to hear a little bit some of the text that the Sfat is listening to, so that we can then understand what he's saying. So I am on page number 3, the pasuk and the recurrence of the verb vayera we saw already earlier. Source number 2 says as follows. That's the midrash on vayera. Shall I read it right away in English? It's okay? Okay. And when after my skin is hurt or destroyed, then through my flesh shall I see God. This is a pasuk from Job. The Midrash has in mind that Abraham just had the Brit Milah, and it connects to the pasuk of Job saying, after my skin was hurt, this is very interesting to listen to. Through my flesh, mi besari echeze Eloha. Through my body, I was able to see God. What could that mean? So the Midrash continues. Abraham said, after I circumcised myself, many proselytes came to attach themselves to this sign, the covenant. Abraham thought that after the Brit Milah, he will be set apart from the world. And he is surprised to see that since he has the Brit Milah, many people are coming to him. In other words, when you retrieve, something attracts people. Then through my flesh shall I see God. Had I not done so, the Brit Milah, why should God have revealed himself to me? In other words, without the Brit Milah, I would not have received the revelation. And that's why it says, Vayera Elav Hashem. And Kadosh Baruch Hu appeared to him. That's one Midrash. Let's call it Midrash number 1. Okay? Any question about Midrash number 1? Midrash number 1 is basically making the connection between Avram's awareness that the Brit Milah enables the revelation. Midrash number 2 is source number 4, and it's really working on what you just said about Hagar. And God, we saw this earlier today, Vayifkach Elohim et einea. God opened her eyes. So Midrash number 4 says as follows. Now I must say, to read this Midrash those days in Israel is really special. Rabbi Simon said, the ministering angels, Malachei HaSharet, hastened to indict him. So when God was about to save Ishmael with water, the Malachim, the angels, came to God and said, hey, Sovereign of the universe, will you bring up a well for one who will one day slay your children with thirst? Do you want to save this Ishmael who one day later in history his children will basically try to kill the Jews? So God says in the Midrash, what is he now? Tzaddik or Rasha? He demanded. So the angel said, he's righteous, was the answer. So God says, I judge man only as he is at that moment, said God. I'm not trying to project history. I only look at the person here and now. And not through a lens of what he will do or what his children will do. That's what we call in philosophy. This is against essentialism. That means you take one person and turn it to be representative of a whole group. I only look in God says that person right now here. He's not a Russia. I have to save him. What's the question? Therefore, the Torah continues. Here I will quote the Hebrew, and therefore it says, "Kumi se'i et hanar vayifkach et einea," and that's why he opened her eyes, Hagar's eyes. But the Midrash is not over. Rabbi Binyamin ben Levi and Rabbi Yohanatan ben Abraham said, "Hakol becheskat sumin." In English, all may be presumed to be blind. Who is all? Who is the all? Every human beings are basically what? Blind. That's an amazing midrash. All the human beings are blind. But what are you talking about? You're not blind. Well, yes, in a way we are blind. Because we all can only see what we are used to see. Until the Holy One, blessed be He, enlightens their eyes. Okay. Now, what we have, this is Midrash number 2. In Midrash number 2, in other words, we have this idea that the Malachim try to prevent God to save Ishmael. He only looks at Ishmael as he is right now, not more than that. And Rabbi Binyamin says, well, all human beings are blind. Very powerful. Now we can go to the Sefer, page number 4. And I won't do all of it with you. I'll begin line number 8. And what is interesting, the Sefer begins first to work on Midrash number 2, the one we just read, and tries to explain what is going on. Here you'll help me with the translation if needed. Ki ha'adam nivra b'tzelem Elokim. Human being is created by God's image, or in God's image. אם כן, מכל עבר ועבר יש לו למצוא השייך לו בצלם הפנימי. Therefore, every limb, every, organ, thank you. Every organ, that's a metaphor obviously, should in principle be acting from within that inner Tzelem Elokim. I will explain in a moment what that means. Ach ha'avonot mastirim, but the sins are not enabling that to happen. Al yedei shemidabek, as you say here in Europe, the Gashmias. But the Gashmias, I would say here, is vulgarization. The vulgarization. When there is no aesthetical spirituality, when everything that drives human being, this is a very interesting definition of what is a chet, avon, a sin. A sin is when you live your life in a way that does not enable the inner light in you, the inner divine image in you, to shine out in how you do things. That's what they call it. It's a spiritual aesthetics. When you're vulgar, there is no Tzelem Elohim shining out. So Tzelem Elohim is something that needs to be cultivated in the way we do things, but we do things with our body. With our body. Tzelem Elohim is not an idea up there, it is in us. He continues. ולכן נתן הקדוש ברוך הוא תרי"ג מצוות לזכך הגוף. So the mitzvot are a means, a way to help our body כדי שיוכל הנפש להתגלות בגוף האדם. So that the soul could express itself where? In the human body. So I grew up in Europe, and somewhere in my memory, this kind of ideas sound a little bit not Jewish to me. So maybe it's my education, I don't know, Antoine. But the Sefer is saying something very dramatic, very dramatic. And if it's not clear enough, I brought you, he says it again in a different teaching. Look at the very last line on the same page. רק לומר שגם הגוף נברא בצלם. That the body itself is an expression of the image of God. Not only the soul, not only as Kant thought, eventually reason, but the body itself is in some ways the image of God. You would tell this Maimonides, Rambam, it's the end. You can't even listen to it. But for the Sfas Emes, he invites us to look at our body. The body itself, not as a tool, not as a kli, not as an instrument only, but the body itself is Tzelem Elokim. And that's why Jews, the way of being in the world is how you do things. Na'aseh mishma. The mitzvot are an attempt to, this mitzvot aseh, are an attempt to cultivate a way of being. And here I said earlier, our body, that's a wrong language for Sfat Emet. It's not that there is an I who has a body. You are body I. There is no I have a body. We are body human beings. So the way we relate first ourselves to our body, and of course to other people's body, is for the Sfat Emet really the kernel, the essence of Tzelem Elohim. I don't want to be too dramatic, but I'd like just to point out how eventually, it's a long road to go, killing another person, especially in the name of God, has everything to do with the inability to see in the body of the other person. And that's why I personally here think, together with Abdel Bidal, which I quoted at the beginning of my talk, this Muslim intellectual who just wrote today's piece, that what we have to reclaim from within our tradition is the holiness of the body. Not only the liberal take that everyone has a soul, everyone has different ideas, and that's where we have to be tolerant one to each other, for sure. But that's not enough. There's something to be said about how we look at the body and what kind of gaze do we cultivate about the body. First our own, other people's as well. The Sfat Emet sees this Vayira Elav Hashem, and you'll see continues with that in a moment, as being that about that. It's about how do you look at your body and other people's body. Can you bring yourself to see the body Tzelem Elohim? That's not the whole small thing. But I'm not saying, how do we get there? That's a whole educational process. But that's a value to think about, which is very different than to look at the body as something to be consumed, to be sold to, as to be replaced. Nobody can be replaced. Let me just continue a little bit with the Sfat Emet here before I wrap this up. In the second part, it goes back to line number 16 to the Brit Milah. But the Brit Milah is the very first mitzvah, although we don't count it as a mitzvah here from Bereschit, but in the chronology, the very first mitzvah in the Torah, what we give to Jews, was the Brit Milah. So for the Sfat Emet, the Brit Milah is precisely that. It is also not only, Brit Milah is Brit Milah, obviously, but it is also a metaphor. It is a metaphor because of Brit Milah you have to lehasir et ha'olam. You have to pull away something that prevents you to see. And that's the very first mitzvah. So he says, line number 18, דע מה למעלה ממך, שיכול האדם להסתכל בדמות נפשו כל שלמעלה. In other words, the Brit Milah symbolically here is an act where we are training our eyes to put something aside so that we can see beyond what we see and to see what is the divine element or dimension in our body and other people's body. For us, this requires certain aesthetics of how we do things. But it for sure requires an aesthetic of how we look at other people. What can we see? Oh, you can't see anything. That was a great timing. So now you see in the unseen. Now he says, וזה, on line 18, וזה וירא אליו ממש. You see what it says? It doesn't say וירא אל אברהם, it says וירא אליו, to him. For the Sfat Emet, mamish, he says, mamish. What is the mamish here? He doesn't say what is the revelation, but there is something that Abraham can experience in being a body, not in being a spiritual guide in the seventh heaven. We all are body people.
Abraham saw it by himself.
Yes, but only after the Brit Milah. Because it requires this ability, as a metaphor now, to open yourself, to put something aside in order to be able to see something different. That's Vayira Elav Mamash. So he says, I continue to read a little bit, the Mikodem Ktiv Vayira Hashem El Avraham. Hu El Bechinat Hashem Shelo. When it says Vayira El Hashem El Avraham, he's calling to Avraham, Mr. Avraham, that's your name. But when it says Vayira Elav Hashem, that's why it says Mi B'sari Echazeh. It is Avram's experience in his body. In other words, a religious experience, spiritual experience for the Sfat Emet is not what we call today disembodied experience. You take some drugs and you're in a different world, right? It's always in and through your body, and the body is limited. But this is where you want to experience life. Experience with spirituality is experiencing in the way you do things. That's why Kiyum Mitzvot is so central for you. But it requires an aesthetics of Kiyum Mitzvot, which trains your eye then to see things differently. So in that vein, maybe, I'm going back now to Vayera, please open Vayera, Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Yud Aleph. It's only like my way to wrap this up. Perek Yudchet, Pasuk Aleph. So I started today by saying, can we rethink and find new old voices in our tradition and provide a venue for spirituality and religious life, but also be a Jewish voice for the many phenomena that we see around in the society in which we live, and we're happy to live in that society. And yet, I said something about the way people look at the body of their own and others. I said through the little Prince something about how people look at other people, or only can see what is numbers and concepts. I said something about Rilke, who really says we have twisted our eyes so that we can't see the open. The open is the living. We only see what is close. And now the Sfat Emet invites us to think about the first mitzvah, which is Vayira Elav Hashem, saying that the body itself should be looked at as Tzelem Elohim. That requires a way to look. Now, the difficulty with Parashat Vayera is as follows. That every time in the Torah, when it says Vayidaber Hashem El, or Vayira Hashem El, Moshe, Abraham, whoever, what is following them? What is it that follows?
Lemor.
Lemor. And then what follows them?
Daber.
What he said. the content. He says, mitzvah, go there, do this. There is something that is said. The problem with Parashat Vayera is that Vayera elav Hashem Elohim Mamre, and depending on you read, but then according to Rashi, Avram said, excuse me, I have something more important to do, right? So something is, that's the brilliant, Rashi is brilliant here. Because Rashi says, how does Rashi says, Vayera elav Hashem? Levaker et hacholeh, to visit the sick. Why? Because it was just after the Brit Milah. But it's brilliant because Rashi understands that if God appears to Abraham and doesn't say anything, the only purpose is just to be. Don't talk. Be. You know, those people going to a shiva and they tell about themselves to the people who sit in shiva. Just be there. Just be. Shut up. And let the other person speak, right? So, be there. So this is an amazing meaning of Rashi. Vayera elav Hashem. What did he say? Nothing. Levaker et hacholeh, just to be with him. But you could offer another interpretation. Vayera elav Hashem, and God appeared to Abraham. Vehu yoshev petach ha'ohel kachom hayom, and Abraham was sitting in the tent at the warmest time of the day. Vayisa einav vayar. You see it again, so as we said in the beginning, the lifting of the eyes, and the second vayar. V'hinei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav vayar. Vayar aslikrata. Through the influence of the Maharal of Prague and Emmanuel Levinas, I would like to suggest another reading here, which is that indeed God revealed himself to Abraham. And there is no content, and yet there is a content. Which one? That Abraham was capable of lifting his eyes, Vayera Vayar, and see three strangers walking out there who may need some water and some food. And that is the content of the revelation of God to Abraham. Or to say as Emmanuel Levinas, the ability of Abraham, because he had the Siret HaMilah, he doesn't have the Brit Milah, he can see, he doesn't just see three strangers walking. You could say in those times, you see Shlosha of the Avodah Zarah, because he didn't know these were angels, right? So these are. He was able to see more than what you see. He was able to see three people who need what? To be studied. So he could see something different. He wasn't blinded by what they were wearing, etc. And we go there. This is what it means. That's, I would say, I'll be careful. This is one instance of what it means, Vayera elav Hashem. The revelation of God is what the human being can also, not only, but also see the Tzelem Elohim in three stranger people who need help. And this is a theme that runs through the entire Sefer Bereschit. So this is how I'm closing this up. As I was talking about beginning to think about how we look, what we look at and what we see. And for the third time I must say, I join first, I hope that this limud is לרפואה שלמה של כל הפצועים and לעילוי נשמתם של כל ההרוגים, from all those who were killed, and as I said, especially because they were killed in some version of the name of God. Any questions?
I have two questions. I'm a scientist, but also I'm a spiritual scientist. And I would actually say, is it possible to resolve the contradiction between matter spirit, Elohim, not in a way that eventually we know that everything is chemistry, everything is material, everything is genes, everything is epigenetics, and I'm sure there are also genes for spiritualism. So, and that's for sure true. So, isn't it that within the matter, within the DNA, there are genes for the spiritualism? So within our body, in our material, actually nothing else than spiritualism is actually the source from. So can by this actually resolve the problem, going really deep down to materialism, but eventually this is also the source for spiritualism? This is the first question, and the second question is, what would be your opinion? What do you think how Saint-Exupéry would have looked at the movie La Vita è Bella, where you have in the concentration camp the child looks or is forced to look what he sees in a different way. So this also means you can enforce on anybody what he should see or should not see. So what do you think would Saint-Exupéry think about this movie?
Thank you. You don't expect me to really answer the first question. The first question is I want to think about, and I guess I should first learn more about what you hinted to in terms of the genes of spirituality. I don't know much about that. Nothing actually. So I need to learn. And then to go back to the question, in principle, could a materialistic answer be the answer to what seems to be contradiction? That's in itself a very interesting question. And at what point is a materialistic view stops to be materialistic, which is also an important question. So I don't want to go into that, but that's very. I've seen that movie. I don't recall all the details. But to take your last line, which is, of course, we can force, people would say, train or manipulate people to see what they see. I think you just, and he would say, you are forcing yourself into the open door. Because I just hinted, the extent to which the visual that we are visualizing today is not necessarily for manipulative reasons, but has a manipulative effect, is for me essential to rethink education. In other words, when I have all of my future teachers in my classroom at university who believe that just by bringing two screens in the classroom and making something actual, I'm not thinking about finding information and data, which is obviously we gain a lot of time, but that's not enough. This is not, I'm not impressed by having like an online, I don't know what, with I don't know whom, to replace reading. I'm just making this up, right? I'm thinking about Albert Camus' description of being in Algeria, reading about snow in France, which he had never seen, obviously, right? But where is the imagination? There is no religiosity without imagination. I don't think everything should be into the screens. That's the worst thing to do. We're shutting down imagination. Without imagination, there is nothing going to be done. A certain kind of imagination. I think, in that regard, the amount of manipulation, and some of it is not, some of it is intentional. That's advertising and everything, which, as you know, it's using psychological theories about how to activate people's desire to think that they haven't consumed yet and they're already on to the next thing. That's very simple, that's basic consumerism. And people think about it, they use what they know to do that. But I'm talking about the whole other range which is not manipulative, but it just happens. So when people talk about critical thinking today, especially in education, I would like to push the critical thinking, not only as they say, towards religious beliefs, all da-da-da-da. What about the critical thinking here and now? How could you claim to be free when you're taught? It's interesting. Everyone claims to be, so many young people claim to be free, and yet they're all dressed the same. and they all sing the same songs, and it's all in the name of autonomy. What is autonomy? They all eat the same chocolate. What's the autonomy? Okay, so what I'm saying, this is much more challenging for current, and all these people were very serious thinking about autonomy. I think the autonomy is updated today. And that's why this is my last sentence. I have 3 books which all of my students have to read, besides this curriculum, right? One is The Little Prince. You can't be an educator without that. Well, there are 4 books actually. The second one is Elie Holzer, The Art of Love. They look at me, The Art of Love, and say, yes, the Art of Love. How can you think you want to live a life? And what are you talking about? Okay, that's 2. 3 is Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury. Science fiction, but it's not science fiction anymore. And then you can see the effect of screens on people's psyche. And 4 is the appendix of George Orwell, 1984. Why the appendix? And here I'm very serious. George Orwell, as we all know, wrote 1984 as a very strong and deep critique of totalitarian regimes, especially the Soviet Union, the communist regime. And he shows us how the use of language manipulates people's psyche, feelings, opinions, and actions. At the end, he has this appendix, and he calls it the new language. You know, for instance, in the new language, you don't say good and bad. You say good and no good. Why would you say bad? What does it take for people to grow up without having the word bad? Well, they want to name the government bad. It's brilliant. Now, this is we say when we study Rashi, we say יש פשט ויש דרש. פשטו של מקרא ויש דרשו. You have not to say פשט. You have עומקו של הפשט. You have the pshat, but you have the deep pshat. Many students of Orwell claim that the pshat of Orwell was the critique of totalitarian religion, the use of language, how to manipulate people. But the unconscious pshat is that he wrote for the capitalist society also. But with one difference. If there is a central government who is manipulating people, people are free. But in their freedom, they manipulate themselves. And when you reread the appendix of George Orwell, how does it work, that kind of language? Which is not, I'm not saying like a big brother doing this, I'm just saying it just happened. And it's pretty amazing to see. I'll just give you an example. This is Orwell, that's 70 years ago, right? Why would you use many words if you can say it in a few words? That's one of the principles of new language. Why is that important? Because the less words you have, the less poetic you are, the less imagination there is, the more people will obey. The more the range of life experience is narrow. Well, isn't it interesting that some people spend most of their communication today with 120 characters, not more. Twitter. What does this do to education and to the human psyche? That's what I'm asking. I don't know the answer. But I don't want to be blind about that. That's why I wanted to read all. So I will go back and watch this movie again. I appreciate that. But what I was saying is that it's only when people manipulate other people. Sometimes we do things people and Twitter probably serves very lofty goals. I'm just saying, but while serving them, you may put yourself as the Chassidim say, galut sheba galut. You're not aware of the galut anymore. That's what I want to be critical about, not less than the other critical thing that we all as liberal people are brought up with. Be critical, yes. What about the critique of what we are, what we do? I don't think there is a way out for serious spiritual claims and education, both Jewish and non-Jewish, without that kind of policy.
The question is just where does the ends?
Maybe never. Maybe never. But that's all the difference in the world. You can just do as if there is nothing, or you can just try to work with it. And more than that, we're human beings, we're not God. Yes, please. The lady here, yes. And then you can speak.
In what way does Sfat mean that if you live the Taliyad mitzvot, that's going to help reveal, let's say, the working inside of you? Because
it's not an automatic thing, right?
It's
not magic.
Right, it sounds great, but I don't see it.
Thank you.
And the other question is, well, in Vayera, if it takes God to reveal himself for over Abraham's eyes, then what about all of us? He doesn't reveal himself to us. Does that mean, do you need something supernatural to happen to you so that you actually can see?
Thank you. Thank you for this question. Should I answer that? In short. The mitzvot are not magic. I'm going to make this a little bit more as a caricature than what it is, but there is a certain level of obsession, but a healthy obsession in Hasidism, in Hasidic thinking about kavanah, intention, presence, awareness, consciousness. What I must say, I like especially about some of the Hasidut, very different currents, especially, is that they're not fooling themselves. They know that spiritual life is not to be on a high. You have highs and lows, day and night, darkness and light. And you celebrate failure also. You have days off. You even have Shabbos off. But you are trying to be intentional about opening yourself again and again and again as much as you can. And just use any technique that helps you. That's why it's easy. So the mitzvot aseh, the positive comment for sure, is a kind of spiritual cultivation of awareness by doing, and doing awareness. There is nothing magical about it. You all know the Hasidic story. Rabbi, you won't believe it, I went through the entire Shas, right? And the Rabbi says, nice, but did the Shas got through you, right? Okay, you could ask the same about Shabbos. You could ask about mitzvot. I did, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, fine, but it only depends on you. And they didn't fool themselves. So there is nothing magical about it. That's why I appreciate your question, because I didn't say this, but when Sfat Emet sets this bar like very high, it doesn't like a romantic kind of thing. He says, that's what we're working on every day. That's what I'm trying to work on, you know, and you could have different ways. By the way, I don't know if I think you wouldn't agree with me, but I think that to study the Little Prince is a way to help him with the Little Prince. I really believe that. It's not only the Little Prince. I mean, you have to cover up mitzvot, you have a whole tradition for all also. So that's the second question was around.
That you need a revelation to see.
Right, revelation. That's a very. You'll have to invite me a second time. But I'm just joking. But what I'm saying is, what do we mean by revelation? The Hasidut reads the Torah also through the Remez, you know, Pshat, Remez, Drash, so there are 4 levels of reading. Most of their readings is Remez. So then revelation takes a different meaning. Revelation is not that you are somewhere in a heavenly voice like, you know, Spielberg, you know, stalking. That's not good. I mean, that we didn't have to wait for Hasidut. It's a Rambam. All the great thinkers of Judaism really got that very early on. From Rav Tzadok Gaon, Rambam, and on. Revelation is something that happens. No one around you can hear it. I'm not talking about Bnei Israel is Bnei Israel. That's the past. The present, what is revelation? What do we mean by that? It is something that happens, something that you're aware of, something that you can work on. No one is walking around saying, I heard God, because if this would be okay, we would take that person and put him in some places, right? But still, it doesn't mean that there are not glimpses of, you know, people say to this spirituality, I use the word because I haven't found a better word yet, but I don't like the word spirituality. And one of the reasons I don't like it, because it is spirit. So what's the body? That's so Christian, okay? I don't like that. I don't like it. But I couldn't find, I can't communicate with people, so I'm using that word and I'm like, okay? But, so what are we talking about? Being deeply in a moment, which is not a small thing today. When we always up to the next thing before we're done with one thing. Here Shabbat is extremely central to the cultivation of being, as Winnicott said, not doing, being, right? But it requires work. Is that revelation? Well, in what sense? I think some would say yes, it is in many ways. So I don't think revelation is up there for special tzaddikim, and maybe that's my last word. One of the reasons that Susie, my wife, says, since we got married, we never lived as a couple. We always a third person in the game. So 10 years we live with Maimonides. You know, Susie, Elie, and Maimonides. Then we had like 2 philosophers, non-Jews, and now I like 10 years with the Sfat Emet already. So one of the reasons I live with Susie and the Sfat Emet is that the Sfat Emet is in a tradition of Hasidism that is coming from the Kotzker Rebbe, the Psishcha. What's very special about this branch of Hasidism is that they really rebelled about the Rebbe as being the tzaddik. They said, this is not Hasidism, because if the Rebbe is doing it for you, so this is work, this is idolatry. So Hasidut is that everyone should do his own work. The Rebbe is the one who gives, hasha'ah, say, inspiration, guidance, teaching, but he can't do it instead of you. So that's when he talks about revelation, he talks about those moments of glimpses. Which, when you begin to talk about those moments, you only can use metaphors. And that's why we need also poets. And I think that Sfat in his own is a poet. He knows that. So when we talk revelation, we have revelation of the Torah, since the destruction of the temple that's gone. Now we have Chachamim. But the Chachamim talk about the course of the and that's a revelation we talk about. So I could say much more about that, but I just wanted to give the orientation. That's why I'm not saying everything is the same. It's not the same. But that's why I say there are some colleagues outside the Jewish tradition, which I think are on the same page in searching for those things today. And it's getting much more challenging in a world where, as I said in the beginning today, I can't just put this away, right? Body of human beings are just targets to be killed in the name of God. Toda Rabba. Thank you very much.